In this video, I'll give a demo of the Poetic Imagery assignment. The poem I chose to reference was Little Brother by Marie Tozer. We played once at the shore. A flock of gulls littered the coastline. When I find myself missing you, I return to that scene. Pink knobby knees, carried by webbed feet, play in the waves which break at the edge of ocean. The cool water, the breaking bubbles, and me. I really like this poem. I responded to it as being very kind of bittersweet, almost like a really nice memory that's lost or impossible to get back to. So I wanted my composition to kind of reflect that contradiction almost. And I wanted something containing the figures, but very small in a larger, semi-realistic, but a little bit dreamlike, a little bit memory-like world. So I was planning to use a mix of atmospheric and linear perspectives. So I started off just sketching that out. As I go through this whole process, you'll see me looking at a lot of reference images. Sometimes I'm tracing those directly in Illustrator. Other times I'm just looking at them for kind of visual inspiration or for helping me think through how my images will be constructed. So you can see here I'm in Illustrator just setting up my reference images, looking for some more, getting those in, and then starting to trace over. And at this point I'm just really broadly fleshing out the composition, not really making any big final decisions yet. So again, this is a totally fine way to work, to look at reference images, maybe bring them in and trace directly over them. But I think the great thing about working in Illustrator is you don't have to completely be beholden to the photograph that you're using. You could almost treat this more like making a collage and then tracing over that collage, where you can sort of pick and choose the best parts of photographic references and make changes to them to suit your composition. And you'll see me doing that a lot here. So I started off with this one seagull character that you see in the foreground on the left, and eventually I ditched that because I didn't like how it was adding to the composition. So I switched out to this other one. And if you're doing the vector drawing like we've been in the video so far, using as few points as possible and getting more practice, this starts to get really quick and really fluid, so it makes it very easy to make these kinds of changes. As I'm working here, I'm making sure to go back and reference the poem for parts that inspired me in terms of how I wanted to make the visuals in my composition. So here I'm experimenting with some different pattern fills on the seagull body. I ended up not using these because I didn't like how they looked. But again, you can see how flexible it is to play with this stuff and try and see what looks good. So in a lot of ways, this process ends up being a little bit more like sculpting versus drawing, where we can sort of put things down and take them back, and it's much more fluid and forgiving. So here I'm just looking at more reference images, using some clipping masks like we covered in the video to make the toenails and the feathers. And another thing you'll see me spending lots and lots of time on here is the color palette. So of course, in this assignment, we can have whatever colors, whatever graphic styles we'd like, and that actually ends up presenting a big challenge because those choices are really important for how things look. So you'll see me here bringing up lots of different swatches and testing things out and switching around quite a bit from start to finish. And there I was using a compound path to make a little inner tube. Now I'm bringing in a reference photo for some seagulls. Another thing that's really great about working with photographic references in Illustrator is your resolution doesn't matter. You can see how pixelated this reference image is, and it's fine because I'm just drawing over it and I'm just using it for some kind of generic inspiration, generic guidelines. You'll notice as I'm tracing out these seagulls how often I'm making changes after I've drawn out my shapes. Again, that's a big advantage to drawing with the pen tool, drawing with as few points as possible. It makes it really, really easy and fluid to make changes after you've done an initial shape. So experimenting with some different ways of drawing out these seagull shapes. It's another thing we covered in the Pathfinder video. And now I'm just starting to separate these out into a few different layers for foreground, middle ground, background. And that helped me to do this combination of linear perspective and atmospheric perspective, where I have one layer with larger seagull shapes in the foreground, one layer with medium size in the middle ground, and one in the background. So both with scale and with saturation, I'm able to get that depth of zones of recession, essentially. You can see here I'm experimenting with some brush strokes on those seagull shapes. I really ended up not liking that. I found it was very distracting. It didn't really let me do those zones of recessions that I was just talking about, and it didn't really match with the graphical style of the rest of the composition that I was aiming for. But again, really, really easy to try these things out and decide whether or not I want to keep those changes. So you can see here I'm just testing different color palettes, using my swatches. That makes it easier. And same thing for the sky. At this point, I wanted to focus a little bit more on the surf and the part where the water meets the sand. So looking at a lot of reference photos of shorelines and waves and beaches. And I decided I wanted sort of an additional water shape where I could have like a deeper section of the water and a shallower section. So I'm just kind of offsetting the shape that I've already drawn and kind of sandwiching in an additional water shape in between the dark water and the sand. And that allows me to do some of the styling where I'm making it look a little bit more like waves washing up on the beach. And, you know, I thought that was appropriate since that's something that's really explicitly referenced in the poem that I'm using. And then just doing some little tweaks, seeing how far I want to go in terms of, you know, adding detail, adding visual effects here. But in the end, I found a fairly plain approach worked best for me, where you can see I'm adding just some little strokes to make the waves there. And now I'm getting some reference images for some human figures. So, you know, I'm thinking of this poem very much about the relationship between two siblings. And so myself, I'm a little brother, so I kind of relate to that more from the little brother perspective. And of course, if you have siblings, you might know that situations look very different depending on where you are in the birth order. So bringing in a couple of human figure references to trace over. And again, this is where you'll see the combo of, you know, using a reference image and then sort of making it your own with vector drawing. It's really powerful because you get really, really flexible. You'll notice here, so I'm adding things like the hair blowing in the wind. I'll go through and make adjustments to the proportion of the body parts. So for example, the figure on the right, I wanted to make look kind of like a smaller child. So I ended up increasing the size of the head, decreasing the size of the leg. And because of the way that I drew things out using overlaps, that was really, really easy. Now here again, I'm just focusing on the surf. So, you know, I'm referencing that language in the poem, talking about playing in the bubbles, using a compound shape to make kind of a stylized, you know, graphical version of some foamy waves washing up on the beach. And then just making some tweaks to the composition there. And then just a few last changes to color palette, and I'm pretty happy with this composition. I overall probably spent about 5 or 6 hours on this, so hopefully you get some good ideas in terms of a broader approach for this week's assignment.